So hello and welcome to this episode of the New Gig podcast. I'm your host, Glen Hodgson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by entrepreneur, investor, and also CEO of AppJobs, Mr. Alok Alström. Good to have you here.
Good to be with you, Glen.
Let's dive straight in and just give us a little bit of background about AppJobs, but also your experiences. You've been in the sector for a time now and been involved with a lot of cool leading companies. It'd be great to have your insights and a bit of background.
So AppJobs we started AppJobs about 4 years ago, and the idea had its origin. I used to work for Uber as a general manager in Sweden, and realized that this thing called the gig economy, back then it was called sharing economy still, but that this phenomenon, whatever we call it, would continue to grow. And we felt that maybe the first phase of that growth is the creation of a lot of gig companies like Uber, but we felt that there was a need for infrastructure and support services and other things around it, for gig workers and for gig platforms, and I think that's why we started AppJobs, as a sort of attempt to start building the different services and support systems that are needed in the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been quite a journey. There's a lot of development and revolution as well as evolution, I think, in the sector as we go over time. And it seems as well that the pandemic has turbocharged a lot of the trends that were already in place as well, Alok.
Absolutely. I think that if we look at when the gig or sharing economy started, it was from the ashes of the last financial crisis, right, in 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
I think in general, when there's a financial crisis, you tend to see that well, first of all, there's an increased unemployment rate, and you see that a lot of companies want to move their fixed cost into variable cost. So that, together with more powerful smartphones and more powerful connectivity, led to the creation of the gig and sharing economy. And I think that this time with the pandemic, it's not only something that impacts the world financially, but there is also a supercharging element in the fact that all companies in the world now have been almost like they got a crash course in how to work through digital processes and digital. I mean, just the conversation that you and I are having now. I mean, and that, of course, decreases the hurdle for more companies and more verticals to enter the space. So absolutely, there's a turbocharging effect to it.
And how is the mindset, would you say, is changing? Because the technology has been there for quite a long time, and of course, technology is evolving and becoming more powerful. But probably the biggest barrier has been this mindset element that 9 to 5 is a job, and basically anything around that is probably something secondary or not quite as good. Whereas with people from lawyers to software engineers now working from distance as opposed to in an office structure, has this kind of changed the mindset, would you say, Alok?
My impression is that the shift in mindset, yes, on one hand, it has to do with the sort of 9 to 5 and the working hours and the format around that. But even more so, I think that the mindset have shifted when it comes to how important it is to have an office or a physical place to not only to go to, but to almost see as the company. I mean, I think that most people traditionally have seen their company as a physical place that they go to. And you go to your job, right? And you go to your office, and I think that the big shift in my mindset that has occurred now is that I think many more people realize that there is no need in this digital world, in many cases or in increasing amount of cases, for that physical location.
Yeah, this is something that is evolving. So it's kind of freeing people as much as anything else to be able to not have the same distance issues, maybe not have to be in the biggest, most expensive cities, traveling backwards and forwards. There's a democratization effect here, perhaps, as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, there might even be an effect of people realizing that they get more stuff done when they're not constantly, interrupted you are in a normal workplace. But I mean, there are of course there are drawbacks as well in terms of social interaction and so on. But I think that even on that part, there's we're going to see some almost like leapfrog development in terms of how that is addressed. And I think that I think that Clubhouse is a great example of that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of other examples as well, but even on the social part, there's a lot of stuff that's being done. So absolutely.
But that's great to hear about that. And also, you've had skin in the game for a long time as well. You said before you worked as a general manager for Uber. But what are the sort of the biggest trends you've seen over the past few years in terms of how the platform economy, gig economy, project economy, whatever you like to call it, the way that is developing?
I think one development which is quite big is that when this phenomenon started, it was very much isolated around startups from Silicon Valley, and I think
Right.
that with the pandemic, or accelerated by the pandemic, we are starting to see more traditional companies, or companies with a traditional labor model, let's say,
Yeah.
starting to look to gigify part of their
Yeah.
supply chain or value chain. And I think that's a significant shift or development in what we're seeing. And then of course, apart from that, I think that also politically now it's starting to mature and realize that there is a need for legislation and regulation around this phenomenon, which for quite a few years this could be sort of swept under the rug, and
Yeah.
now it's that's not the case anymore with Prop 22. And by the way, I mean, this is going different directions, right? So we don't really know where it will end up when it comes to
Mm.
legislation or regulation, but that it's being addressed in a way that it wasn't before. So I would say those are probably the two biggest developments. And then of course also in the development of surrounding infrastructure,
Yeah.
in terms of insurance and tax robots, and even from government agencies. When I entered this industry a couple of years ago, the tax authority in Sweden, where I live, they
Yeah.
didn't really know how to handle it, and now there's actually a section on their website that has to do with this. So
Mm.
yeah, there's a lot of movement, absolutely.
And this seems like a very good progress that's being made as well. That the reality is catching up with the way that people want to sort of live their lives as individuals, more flexibility perhaps, but also companies as well who want the flexibility. They want the efficiency gains that the more of a gigified model can actually offer them as well. And the fact that we've got sort of the traditional barriers in sort of the more traditional companies are already starting to take on this model as well, from kind of the pharma sector, law firms, traditional sectors which you would think as being kind of slower to adopt and having very heavy compliance regimes in place too.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the other thing that was already there, but that's becoming more crystallized as we go along, is that we start seeing that there's a spectrum, right? Sometimes in this discussion around, you tend to get the feeling that there would only be two alternatives: either there's traditional employment, or there's sort of gig work a la Uber. But
Yeah.
that's not really the case. I mean, I think that what we're seeing is it's a spectrum of things, or different types of employment or gig engagements,
Yeah.
and some of them are more flexible, and some of them are less flexible. Now, I don't think that any of this will disappear in the future. I think that we will live with this spectrum, and in some verticals it will shift more towards one end, and in other verticals more towards the other.
Yeah. So and also the sort of physical jobs through a matching platform, or it can be like human cloud work from anywhere to be able to do these things as well. And it's not necessarily that one will grow and the other won't. They can evolve in their own specific kind of way. And I think that there will be benefits, and there will also be some negative factors as well. But if we look at the media, particularly in the European context and also in Sweden, there's a very much a focus on this tiny percentage of what is the platform economy, and also a lot of negativity attached to that as well. I mean, do you think this is something that's being addressed, or something that will change?
I mean, first of all, I think that when it comes to the challenges, and I would like to call them challenges rather than problems, not to discount the pain and hurt that some of these challenges are bringing, because for individuals, a lot of these challenges are actually problems. But I think that for the phenomenon as such, the reason why I would call them challenges is because essentially what's happening here is that thanks to technical development, there are more efficient ways to organize labor and production, and that's net creates more value. Now that value has to be distributed in a way that's fair and so on. And I think that in its infancy, that's not always the case when a development like this happens.
Right.
So I very much acknowledge that for a lot of individuals, this is highly problematic at the moment. Having said that, I think that as this phenomenon matures, a lot of that is addressed, and some of it is addressed by the gig platforms themselves. Some of it is addressed by surrounding infrastructure and service companies, for example, us, like AppJobs, and then you will have the rest of society and legislation and so on. But I think that the other thing that's happening is that there's a shift in frame of mind also when it comes to security, so labor market security, because I think that one of the big critiques against this phenomenon is that yes, it's more flexible. Some people even question that, by the way, but I think mainstream people would say that, yeah, we agree that it's more flexible, but it's also more insecure, right? It's easier to lose your job and so on. So what about work or employment security and things like that? And I think the traditional way to look at that is the security of not losing your job. And I think that hopefully I think we're going into a future where it's not the security of not losing your job that's important. It's the security of having a job, but not necessarily the same one that you had yesterday.
Yeah.
And once you get into that type of thinking or that type of frame, it becomes less scary, as long as there are enough of these platforms and that it's smooth enough to switch between them.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing when people have this kind of anxiety before, whether they're a lawyer, whether they're a software engineer, or a driver, the issue of the security and what is the leap that they're taking into sort of the freelance platform economy world as well. The kind of the real or imagined, the safety net, the social security elements, what happens if they're sick, what happens if they're looking for parental leave, all these kind of things that sort of bring into that, which have been part and parcel with the traditional world of work, and how the insurances and things like that work from the new economy perspective.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of that will mature, and a lot of that maturing will have to do with the ability to switch between different solutions, both in terms of work platforms, but also in terms of what insurance you use and so on. And I think maybe one of the things that's needed going forward, that hopefully all parties in this space could agree to, is that workers need to be able to own and control their data in a better way. I think that GDPR gives consumers a lot of rights over their data. The PSD2 regulation or legislation that came on banks in Europe gives consumers a lot of freedom to move data and so on in the banking system or financial system. I think something similar would probably benefit both gig workers and the gig economy as a whole, if such legislation could come in effect. And I think that that's something that probably all parties, regardless of if they're for or against the gig economy could agree on that strengthening workers' right to their own data and control of that is beneficial.
Yeah. And the power, therefore, to be able to control that, but also to decide what you'll be able to do, to work for multiple employers, if you want to use that word, but also to take on multiple tasks at the same time, but also give you new skills and be able to provide value to different individuals, and not just one employer for the next 20, 30 years, but to be able to use that as a springboard to new skills, new opportunities, and hopefully more personal development for individuals too.
I agree completely. I mean, I think that the challenge there is to, I mean, the worst case scenario or the dystopic scenario here is that people are reduced to commodities, right?
Yeah.
The other scenario, or the utopic scenario, would be that instead of people being reduced to commodities, their skills and abilities are elevated to assets that they can monetize.
Right.
And I think that's, I mean, what politicians and others should look at is how do we push this phenomenon, because this phenomenon will grow regardless. That's
Yep.
that, you know, I hope there's not too much debate about that. You know, it's a technologically driven phenomenon, so there's a natural flow here, or gravity into it. But then the question is, which way will it go? And I think that trying to set it up with the systems and rules and so on, so that it really goes in a direction where people can make the most out of their abilities.
Yeah.
That's I think the way that we all need to push this.
Absolutely, and that should be a benefit for society as well as individuals and corporations, and something hopefully that should be that should be supported. And let's hope as well with the new European proposals, the consultation process, which has just begun on gig workers and gig workers' rights. There seems to be a lot of positivity and a right starting point, as you've said there, Alok, that this is something that's going to happen anyway. Let's harness it and make the best of it, as opposed to try and ignore it or try and kill it, which isn't going to happen anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I've never been a politician myself. I met a few politicians, but I think that the challenge, probably from a political point of view, is to really muster the intellectual strength into realizing the extent of the change here. So that you don't try to apply legislation from an industrial era into a sort of post-industrial gig era, because that, you know, those are so different that won't really work. I think that rather looking at I would rather derive the inspiration from consumer legislation. I mean, legislation around a regulation around how consumers interact with streaming services online and so on.
Yeah.
I think that's probably more relevant in guiding how to regulate this phenomenon.
I think that's great advice at this moment when we're looking at new policies and new ways of being able to do these things. And of course, in the Swedish context, looking at the issue of the labor market and the health and safety issues around work as well. That is, well, now the understanding that this is something that needs to evolve and needs to adapt to the new reality of the platform economy and gig work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, I've grown up in Sweden, and there's a certain way how things are done here from government agencies and so on. And I think for many global companies coming from the outside, it might sometimes look very, I don't know what we should call it, stale or inflexible, but things take time in Sweden. But I also think that when they changed, it's usually pretty well thought through, and at least my impression and experience is that government agencies, although they have their frame of mind and so on, they are quite open to at least discussing and exploring how they should change. But then, of course, there has to be political willpower. Otherwise, none of that matters.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, as you said, this is going to happen anyway. It's still going to, you can argue on the percentage rate, 10, 20, 30% annually, but it's a trend that's been set in motion, and something that's just been increased by the current crises and really the underlying fears of individuals and companies who want to go down this path. And as usual, it's a case of following the talent, which will decide for itself, and the value for corporations.
Agree completely. Agree completely.
Excellent. Well, Alok, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Keep up the good work and being evangelizing about the sector, and keep educating as well. And I think one of the big things that behind this as well, it's not changing mind, it's just filling heads in terms of what this really means, and getting through the sort of the headlines and sometimes the ill-founded negativity about what the sector is and what it's trying to achieve.
Absolutely. I will keep doing it from my end, and I'm happy that we managed to have this conversation, Glenn, and wish that you continue doing the same at your end.
I shall do my best. Excellent, Alok. Thanks for your time, sir.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks.